Greetings, everybody. Welcome back for our reflection on the 26th Sunday of the year, Year C 2022. My apologies if the video is a little bit dark. At the moment, we don't have any power. My parishioners, I'm hoping that all of you are okay. None of you have been affected by floods in the last few days with all of the rain that we've been having. So if the lights all of a sudden come back on while I'm talking, you'll know why. The power's come back. There are a couple of reasons, I think, why the Catholic Church canonizes saints, proclaims them to be in heaven with the Lord because of their life of heroic virtue. First of all, it's to, again, reinforce our faith in the resurrection, and that these people, through the proof of miracles, during their life and also after their death, are now believed to be in heaven with God, and so they can pray for us. That's one of the reasons we canonize saints. But the other reason too is that a saint can be held up to us as an example of how we're called to be disciples today, because we're all called to be saints. And now, it doesn't mean that you have to be a Saint Pio or a Saint Francis or a Saint John Paul II. You have to be yourself. But in all of the saints, there are ways of behaving, there are attitudes, there is the desire, there are commonalities that show us how to be a good Christian, how to be a saint, in other words. And sometimes too, we get if you like, examples from our fellow brothers and sisters. They may not be canonized yet, they probably could be still walking around, but they're an example to us of how to be a good Christian. When I think of that, I think quite a few years ago now, when I was living in the States, we used to have a group of young people, and they were called Cap Corps. Now, you here in Bellingen, in the parish here in Australia, may not be familiar with the Corps in America, but you may have heard of the Peace Corps, which was something that President John Kennedy began. And it was a way for young people to give to those in the community who perhaps were not as well off. And so Cap Corps was the same kind of thing. And so we would have these young people in their very early 20s, usually about 4 or 5, and they'd come and they'd live in a house. And we had 2 houses. We had one in Washington, D.C., and we had one in Baltimore. And they would come and they would spend the whole year of their life living in that house and using what talents or skills they had acquired to serve particularly the poor. And so amongst them, we had school teachers. We also had medical students. We had a medical center in downtown Washington where Hispanics and also others who maybe couldn't afford to go to the doctor were able to come. So it was a way of helping those in need with the talents that we have. And so when we come to the gospel today, we really have an example of what not to do. And it's not just about money. Sure, if we're wealthy, then we have a responsibility to share our wealth. But it's also about the other talents that we have in life as well. So it's not a sin to be rich. That's the first thing. That's not what Jesus is saying. Of course, it might depend how you become rich, but to be rich per se is not a sin. What matters is what you do with the resources you have, whether it's money or otherwise. Are they at the service of God and others, or do we become self-absorbed? And so we hear in the prophet Amos that being wealthy and secure comes with a responsibility to those who are not. And we will be judged on this. A lack of love, agape, the decision, the will to do the good for the other person, a lack of love for the poor and the marginalized will have consequences. In the prophet Amos, it's exile from Israel, exile from Judah. For us, it's, as we see in the gospel, it's exile from heaven. So it's important that we think about what are the resources that are available to us and how do we use them. St. Paul, in the first letter to Timothy, reminds us that we're consecrated to God by our baptism. We're no longer our own. We live for the Lord. And it's our vocation, it's our call to live a saintly and religious life, as St. Paul says, a life of faith, a life of love, a life of witness to the truth of Christ. This is what it means to be a saint. This is what it means to be a Christian. And so you need to ask yourself, do you want to be a saint? That's really the question. It's not a case of, I can't be one, because through the grace of God, we're all called to be saints, and through that grace, we can be it. So it's not a question of the ability, it's the question of desire. Do we want to be? Do we have enough desire that we want to change? And how do you become a saint? How do you respond to the grace of God? Well, you become something by living it. So you simply start to live like the person you want to be. You know, that old saying, just do it. That's how we begin. Take one step in front of another. Start to live like the person you want to be. That's how we respond to the grace of God. In the Gospel of Luke, in the parable of the rich man, he doesn't go to hell because he's rich, but because he hasn't loved Lazarus. He has ignored Lazarus' suffering. That's why he goes to hell. He's also lived his own life without much thought for his own spiritual or eternal future. He's been deaf to the prophets like Amos, and he's been deaf to their constant call to love God and to love your neighbour in practical terms. So the parable is reminding us again of the importance of listening to the prophets. In other words, of reading, praying, and studying the Old Covenant, the Old Testament in the Bible. As we hear in the parable, if a person will not listen to the prophets, then they're not likely to listen to the risen Christ either. So we can ask ourselves the question, do we listen to the prophets? To put it another way, do we read, pray, and study the Bible and seek to put it into practice, as St. James would say? How do you use your resources, your time, your money, your personal gifts and strengths? How do you use those things to be a witness to Christ? How do you use them to love your neighbour? And who is your neighbour? It's the person in need. What more might Christ be asking of you and me? May God bless you.